In this video, we'll be going over the worst Link monsters in the game. But with Link monsters being one of the newest type of monsters added to the game, most of them are more mediocre than actually bad, so just keep that in mind. And at number 10, we have Tindangle Acute Cerberus. This is a Link 3 monster which requires exactly 3 Tindangle monsters as its materials, and its effects are basically, it becomes a 3000 attack beatstick under the conditions that you have 3 or more different Tindangle monsters in your graveyard, including a specific Tindangle monster called Tindangle Base Gardener. Also, it gains 500 extra attack for each Tindangle monster it points to, and if this card declares an attack, you get to special summon a Tindangle token. So basically, this card requires 3 specific types of monsters from an archetype, and all they get for that kind of tough summoning requirements is just a 3000 attack beatstick. That's like using 3 tributes to summon Blue Eyes White Dragon. However, Tindangle monsters really like this card because they have a couple of cards in their archetype which specifically are designed to work with Tindangle Link monsters, and this is the only Tindangle Link monster. Tindangle Trinity allows you to add a card from your deck to your hand if it's used as material for a Tindangle Link monster, as well as send any spell or trap card from your deck to the graveyard. Drumgon's End is a trap card that can only be attached to a Tindangle Link monster, and they have another trap card which allows you to cheat the Tindangle Link monster out of the extra deck. In the OCG, they even have a card called Tindangle Dulse, which grants a Tindangle Link monster that uses as its material 3 attacks during the battle phase. So the Tindangle archetype obviously loves going into the Tindangle Link monster. So they do play Tindangle Acute Cerberus, but not because the card itself is very good. It's more like they're forced to play it, and at least it's a beatstick, which means it doesn't have anything going for it. The trap card made for it, Drumgon's End, does actually give the monster some protection, where it can't be destroyed or targeted by card effects, and allows you to destroy all the monsters that the Link monster points to in order to inflict damage to your opponent, which are all actually really good effects that would have been 10 times better if they were included in the actual Link monster itself, and not attached to a trap card that you have to use in order to unlock its full potential. And at number 9, we have Nephthys, the Sacred Flame. This is a Link 3 monster who requires any 2+ monsters for its materials, including at least 1 ritual monster. And then it gains effects based on the number of ritual monsters used for its Link summon, where if you used 3 ritual monsters, it becomes a 4800 attack beatstick that cannot be destroyed by battle or card effects, nor targeted by card effects. So, like a worse Red Eyes Dark Dragoon, who can accomplish similar feats by just negating a few card effects. Basically, the potential of Nephthys the Sacred Flame is not half bad. It's just using 3 ritual monsters to get to its maximum potential is kind of a lot. Ritual monsters are inherently kinda bad because of how hard they are to get on the field because of just how their mechanics work. Nephthys the Sacred Flame only really saw play in Necron's decks because they can at least get out a fair few amount of ritual monsters in one turn. And Nephthys the Sacred Flame is a decent boss monster to go into against certain decks. It's just too hard to bring out and doesn't gain the best form protections or attack unless you use 3 ritual monsters for its summon. And generally, you don't want to use that many ritual monsters to go into a slightly worse Red Eyes Dark Dragoon. But it is at least an option that exists to decks that can spam out ritual monsters, which is why it's only at number 9 on this list, not at a higher spot. Technically, a niche option for ritual decks. And at number 8, we have Double Byte Dragon. This is a Link 2 monster that requires 2 Link monsters as materials and has the effects where it gains additional attack points equal to the Link ratings of the monsters used for its summon times 300. And it's unaffected by monster effects and cannot be destroyed by battle, except by other Link monsters. So if you know your opponent doesn't play any Link monsters or spell or trap card removal, then you have an option to get a monster who's pretty hard to get rid of. The problem with this card is that a lot of decks do still use Link monsters, and the ones that don't generally have spell or trap card removal. If this card is brought out the most efficient way possible with 2 Link 1 monsters, it's basically a 2100 attack beatstick who only has protection from monsters that are not Link monsters. Which sure, there's still a majority of monsters in the game, but at 2100 attack with no other effects, that isn't really something to be scared of. If you want this thing to be scary, you have to bring it out with really big Link monsters. The maximum attack you can get this thing to under its own effects is 4800. Although that would require you to link away a Link 6 and a Link 5 monster. It would be a huge waste to use those 2 kinds of monsters as materials to bring this card out. And at number 7, we have a Gave Dragon. This is a Link 4 worm type monster who can be brought out using any 2+ monsters except tokens, and then activates in sequence its 4 effects based on the number of types of cards you have in your graveyard when it's Link summoned, where if you have dragon type monsters in your graveyard, you get to inflict 100 points of damage to your opponent for each one. It then gains 200 attack for each dinosaur. All of your opponent's monsters lose 300 attack for each sea serpent, and then you gain 400 life points for each worm in your graveyard. Now, all 4 of these effects are pretty minor, like ridiculously so, and it uses a whole bunch of monsters which generally don't see play together. So the only real use of this card is in its dragon effect to inflict damage to your opponent. It is an incredibly minor amount of damage, at only 100 damage per dragon in your grave, but any amount of effect damage is sometimes useful in extract monsters, just in case you go into overtime and you can win by just inflicting a little bit of damage to your opponent. That's the only reason this card saw any play, because it technically inflicted effect damage, even if it was an incredibly minor amount. And at number 6, we have Bellcat Fighter. This is a Link 3 monster which requires exactly 3 monsters for its materials, including a token. Now, usually Link monsters say you can't use a token, like the previous spot on this list, so this is a big improvement over a lot of other cards. It's like one of the few Link monsters who actually wants to use tokens for its materials. But there's a couple of problems with this card. For one, its Link arrows are kind of terrible, where it has 1 pointing up and 2 to the side. So it's not a Link monster you start your combos with, but one that happens mid-combo. And if it had downward pointing arrows at all, it might have actually seen competitive play. Also, its effect is pretty mediocre. It just allows you to special summon a token if this card destroys a monster by battle. The token itself isn't half bad though. It does have 2000 attack and defense, which is pretty high for a token. Although the main use of Link monsters wanting to use tokens as materials is in order to convert those tokens into effect monsters for better Link summons. But this one requires an awkward amount of tokens at 3, which doesn't fit in with a whole lot of token generators, and doesn't really help you extend combos, and its effect is definitely not useful in the kinds of decks that would want to use tokens to extend combos either. And at number 5, we have Arcana Extra Joker. This is a Link 3 monster which requires 3 warrior monsters with different names as its materials. And then it has the effect that, if a card is activated which would target this card or a card this card points to, you can then discard a card from your hand of the same type, so if it's a monster you discard a monster, a spell for a spell, or a trap for a trap, in order to negate the activation of that card, but not destroy it. So its effect is like a worse version of Invoked Macabre, where it only allows you to protect from targeted effects, which is already kind of lame, but then it has a really restrictive condition on protecting from that targeted effect, and then it doesn't even destroy the card after it negates the effect. Whereas Macabre is a full negate and then banishes the card afterwards. That's why Invoked Macabre is easily the best invoked fusion monster and sees a whole bunch of competitive play. Now, it also does have a floating effect, where if this Link summon card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can special summon a level 4 warrior normal monster from your deck, and if you do special summon that normal monster, you can then add a level 4 warrior monster from your deck to your hand. So, in order to get the wonderful search effect of a level 4 warrior monster, you have to play a level 4 warrior normal monster, which just seems overly restrictive. Sure, if you already play a level 4 warrior normal monster in your deck, then its floating effect is pure advantage, but there aren't really decks that do that. And also, the floating effect only activates if it's destroyed by battle, so that doesn't really matter anyway because big boss monsters are rarely destroyed by battle. Now, this card is based on Arcana Night Joker, a fusion monster that requires 3 specific normal warrior type monsters as its materials, and basically has the same form of protection with its effect. So this Link monster is supposed to be a modern version of that fusion monster, and while it's not worse than its fusion counterpart, it's definitely not good either. And at number 4, we have Backup Supervisor. This is a Link 2 monster which requires any 2 monsters as materials, and if this card is Link summoned using Backup Secretary as one of its materials, then it gains the effect where, if the monster this card points to battles an opponent's monster, you can special summon a Cerberus type monster from your hand. And also, if this card is destroyed, you get to special summon a Backup Secretary from your hand, deck, or graveyard, with both of these effects being a hard once per turn. So the floating effect is fine, and even Backup Secretary isn't half bad. It's just a level 3 Cerberus type monster which can special summon itself from your hand. It's just, for a Link monster that requires a specific named monster as a material, its effect is incredibly mediocre. It requires a monster to attack in order to special summon a specific type of monster from your hand, which is like one of the worst places you want to special summon a monster from during one of the worst phases to do that. Technically, special summoning from the hand is decent, just not during the battle phase. The best time to special summon monsters from the hand is during one of your main phases, or at a time before the main phase 1. And that's basically it. If you just ignore the fact that it requires a specific named monster for its effect, it's a generic Link 2 monster that can use any 2 monsters as materials. So it can still be used in order to convert tokens into effect monsters and be more useful than Bellcat Fighter, since the arrows aren't half bad. But there's a lot better Link 2 monsters you can use instead, and if you do actually fulfill the conditions to use its effect, it's not even a good effect, which is why this card makes this list. And at number 3, we have Vorticular Drumgon. This is a Link 3 dragon, which actually has a good effect. When this card is special summoned, you get to draw 1 card. And being able to draw a card on an extra deck monster is excellent, as proven by cards like Formula Synchron or TG Hyper Librarian. Extra deck monsters that let you draw cards have historically been on and off the ban list in some way because of how useful that is. And to not repeat their past mistakes with the new easier to summon Link monsters, they decided to give Vorticular Drumgon some restrictions so that it could not be abused, in the form of 3 drawbacks. One of them is that this card requires exactly 3 Dark Dragon monsters as materials, so it needs specific types and attributes. It has a hard once per turn on the effect, so you can't use it multiple times per turn, and after the effect resolves, you can't use the monster zones this card points to for the rest of the turn. So if you want to go into this card in order to extend combos, it basically shuts that down. And I guess a soft downside number 4 is it also has ridiculously low attack for a Link 3 monster at only 1000. And you know what? Dark is the best attribute in the game, and dragon type monsters have a ton of support. So you'd think even with all of these downsides, the 3 specific types of cards it requires for its materials would probably warrant the card scene play anyway, right? Well, as it turns out, that was not the case. Even with the great upside of drawing 1 card, it's just too cumbersome to use even with excellent type and attribute in the Dark Dragon type. Turns out, you can overly balance a card, and a good example of that is Vorticular Drumgon. And at number 2, we have Linkerbell. This is a Link 2 monster which requires any 2 monsters as materials and has 2 excellent diagonal downward pointing arrows. However, this card cannot be Link summoned unless you have at least 3 more monsters in your extra deck than your opponent. So if you and your opponent start the duel with 15 cards in your extra deck, and you go first, you can't bring this card out, unless you have a way to get rid of cards in your opponent's extra deck, with maybe something like Lithosegem the Disaster. And if you go second, and your opponent did bring out some cards from their extra deck, chances are you'd probably match their numbers pretty quickly, so this would have to be one of the first Link monsters you brought out before you could no longer meet the conditions for its summoning. And the card doesn't do anything else. Basically, the whole selling point of Linkerbell is just having 2 good arrows, and being completely generic for those 2 arrows, which is why the card only has a downside to it, which is why when Land for Rinkus came out, it immediately power crept the card by basically being what Linkerbell is trying to do, but without any negative downsides. And ever since then, they've just been a lot more Link 2 monsters that have been released that are also completely generic, but also have good effects on top of them, and with those 2 downward diagonal pointing arrows, which power crept Land for Rinkus, like Beat Caught from the Underworld and IP Masquerena. And at number 1, we have Link Bumper. This is a Link 2 monster which requires 2 Cerberus monsters as materials, and has the effect that at the end of the damage step, if a monster this card points to attacks an opponent's Link monster, you can then activate the effect where that monster gains 1 additional attack for each Link monster you currently control, except this card, and those additional attacks can only be used on opponent's Link monsters. Then your other monsters can't attack the turn you activate this effect. So basically, it grants a monster you control an extra attack, but only on Link monsters, and only if you control a whole bunch of other Link monsters that aren't Link Bumper, because for some reason it doesn't count itself when granting those extra attacks. And if this card wasn't bad enough, it also restricts you from attacking with other monsters for the rest of the turn. This card is overly specific, and I have to assume this is probably an anime card they forgot to convert into the real card game, and give it non-incredibly specific effects, because this is not very good. Generally, attacking multiple times is really good if you can use it unconditionally, which is why they usually limit multi-attacks to being only usable on monsters, and that's usually more than enough to balance multi-attacks. Although this card goes even further in restricting what kinds of cards it can attack into, and restricting how you grant those extra attacks, while also having another downside on top of that. And battle-related effects aren't even that good anyway, plus its arrows are kinda terrible. And also its materials are kinda terrible as well. Requiring 2 Cerberus monsters basically means you have to convert regular monsters into Cerberus Link monsters if you want to go into this card outside of Cerberus decks. Not that you'd want to, because any other effect is probably better than this, which is why I think a Link Bumper kind of easily takes number spot on this list, even above a card which only has negative effects, because its effect is hilariously restrictive and specific. Alright, and that's the list. Now, like I said, there are very few Link monsters that actually have bad effects, But if you have any ideas for future videos just like this one, I'd love to hear about them down in the comments. Also, I have a playlist with all of my other worst of top 10s, which will be linked at the end of the video right now.